David Bizard here, and you guys are watching PowerTec 10. In this edition, that would be 146, we are going to take another step into our 5 porting rules series. To be precise here, I wasn't too sure whether this should go into rule number 1 series or rule number 2. So I stuck it in rule number 1 just for the sheer hell of it. Now, what's it about? Well, I think you've already figured that much out. It's all about port velocity, which by default is going to mean 2 things. How much flow we've got and port volume. Let me start by saying how important velocity is. And here, once again, I'm going to quote fellow porter Darren Morgan. He says there's 3 things that you need to take care of when porting heads, and that's velocity, velocity, and velocity. That's as close to being 100% right as is possible. Without velocity, you lose port energy, and that's no good. If you don't have enough port velocity, that almost always means you got the port too big. If you don't have port energy density, which we'll get to, that means you most definitely have the port too big. But we'll get around to that. Now, what I want to do here is to start with something that my friend Chad Spears likes to talk about when people call up and say they want to head with this many cc, and I think he's got fed up with pointing this out. It's not how many cc the port has got, it's where those cc's are. That brings me to the point here of a head porter's number 1 obstacle to flow: corners. Getting flow to go round a corner and into the back of the valve is the most difficult aspect of porting. It also requires the most time in the development. But here's the deal. The bowl dictates how much flows, and the main body of the port dictates, for the most part, how much velocity you have to be able to usefully use in ram charging the engine. So let's get going here and look at some diagrams. What we have here is a stylized conceptual port. The intake tube can be moved anywhere in the top 180 degrees of that spherical or semi-spherical bowl, and the flow will be virtually the same whether it's fully downdraft or horizontally going in at 90 degrees to the outlet. That is because the bowl itself is a great velocity reduction device. In other words, it's acting as a means to slow the air down and change its direction. A setup like this is ideal for testing what size port area is needed for a given sized valve. In other words, it allows the setting up of a port that is the ideal size for the valve concerned. That generally works out between 75 to 78% of the area of the valve. Now you may wonder why such an odd-shaped port and bowl could be of any use to us. That's a good question. What it allows us to do here is to make an analysis of the bowl shape to be able to get the best flow possible in the port. Now, we may be able to get velocity in the port here, but a good question to ask is whether or not it is all lost in the volume of the bowl itself. No. Remember that the pressure in the air is affected by the velocity. The lower the velocity, the higher the pressure, so long as we're not having restrictions which actually turn the energy into heat. Any kinetic energy that was in the port gets turned into pressure energy in the bowl. Now, this is an extreme case here, but you can see that if the pressure goes up in the bowl, it pushes the air past the valve better. So, these are the kind of things we need to achieve with our port. Not easy. But let's do some further investigations on that. The next thing I'm going to demonstrate here is really an exercise in port matching. Now, one of the worst scenarios for port matching is for the downdraft Weber carburetors on a 5.0, or should have said a small block Ford engine, 289 right up to whatever they'll go to. And let me show in this diagram just how bad it is. That's the raw case here. The manifold as you get it and the head already ported. So, can we get that air efficiently round the corner? Much to what may be surprising for you, we can do that very effectively. It's just a question of knowing how. Let's start off at square one. Let's look at that port with nothing more than, let's say, a clay rounded area. Now you'll see that that's how we do it on the flow bench. So what we want to do is somehow make the cylinder head think this on a flow bench and yet still have good velocity in the port. So let's move to the next step, and you'll see that what I've done here is I've put in succession a number of entries closing down on what I think will show what's needed. The plan is to put more and more clay on there until we progressively arrive at the point where we just start to see a flow drop. So let's move on to the next form here, which is just starting to bring in the edges of what will eventually turn out to be the runner. Okay, here we go. This is the start of the runner. Now that doesn't show any drop in flow. So let's go on to the next move, which is, as you can see, is progressively starting to form a runner. Still no flow drop. Now on to the next one. You can definitely see this is a runner, but the form at the manifold face hasn't changed that much. Two questions we need to ask ourselves here. How well does it work, and how does it work? I've made it look relatively simple here. It is, but it takes time and effort to just get it just right. Let's have a look at the flow form. Well, here's the flow pattern. Let me explain how this works. Notice how just about, we'll say on average about a half an inch before the manifold gets to the port, that the shape in that area is very similar to the shape we would use on a flow bench. Now, also note that the air coming down the long side of the port has no option but to turn because the manifold's port wall forces it to do so. Just as it gets to the manifold face, it's traveling in an upward direction towards the short side turn. Now, this is the key to the success of something like this. Now, there's a second aspect here that's equally important. Take a look at the intake manifold again, and you'll see that the air on the long side has to, at the point arrowed, has to turn in an upward direction toward the short side. Normally, on any Chevrolet or Chevrolet-like port, that would apply to Ford and Chrysler and a whole load of other engines, we find that the port flow bare on the flow bench with just that radius entry flows a lot more at the top side of the port than the bottom. Now, because the bulk of the air is traveling on the long side of this turn, and we force it up towards the short side, if we do that just right, it will re-energize the bottom half of the port in the cylinder head. That is, the manifold port at the bottom is high flow, and in so doing, by redirecting it as we show in the drawing, it will re-energize the bottom half of the port in the head. Also, get everything right, and it will cause the airflow around the short side turn to stick to the short side turn, because the pressure below it from the upward motion we generate is slightly higher. How big should we make this port? Well, as small as possible, consistent with keeping the velocity up. And we usually do that by having the cylinder head flow just a bit less with the manifold on than it does off. About 1%, maybe 2% at the most less, is what I try to target here. This means the port energy and the port velocity in the intake manifold are good, and it enhances what's in the cylinder head. Now, what's been shown of this manifold shape enhancement at the manifold to cylinder head face has only been shown side view. The same technique applies plan view. For instance, if you've got a single 4-barrel carburetor, a lot of manifolds out there arrive at the manifold face at an angle, which means the air has to go. Not good. Now, most engine builders really take care of matching the port up, a direct match. But the point is this: at that junction there, the entry is constricted. Imagine we tip it more and more and more, then the gap across the join here gets, the width of the port gets less and less. So, not a good way to do it. Now we apply the same principles in plan view, but also on the manifold I've just shown you, we apply those principles on the side of the port at the bottom. Right, no need to do it at the top because there's less problem with radiusing it, but because it's straight on anyway. So what we're doing here is, on both the previous example and the one here, we're going to slow it down at the point where it's most restrictive. Now, with a single 4-barrel, if we get the radius on the outside of the turn right in the manifold, we can get highly efficient junction at that face. So let me just show you a sketch of how that's done. Well, we've talked extensively on how to get velocity in the port, how to get the best turnaround in the bowls so that we maintain the effect of that velocity in the port, and ways and means of maintaining that velocity at junctions such as manifold faces and the manifold itself. Now let's talk about the whys and wherefores. First, what I'm going to tell you now is a fairly good reason why having just flow figures is not enough. Why? Because all it describes is flow. And the problem is this: velocity in the port is needed as much as airflow. If you're delinquent on either of those, your cylinder head is not as good as it could be. Now, how do we know whether we've made the port too big or too small? Simple. Let's look at it in terms of port energy. Now let me explain what port energy is. I'm sure many of you are gun enthusiasts. That being the case, you will be familiar with the term muzzle energy. That's the energy the bullet has when it leaves the barrel of the gun. It's dependent on the mass of the bullet and the speed with which it leaves the barrel. The more energy it's got, the more it will penetrate the target? Well, and let's say it's a large piece of wood. Given that the more muzzle energy we have, the more it will penetrate that wood, we can liken that to the same as a valve which is partially open. It's presenting a restriction to the flow of air, just like the wood will present a restriction to the passage of that bullet. So, the more energy we have in the port, the more penetration it will have past that valve. Now, we usually have these low valve lifts at the end of the intake stroke and during the overlap period, where the only thing that's going to push charge in is charge energy. It's got to overcome a pressure in the cylinder because the piston's now coming back up the bore at the end of the intake stroke. So it's got to ram that cylinder in spite of the fact the piston's coming up. And at TDC, or in around the overlap area, it's got to ram the cylinder so that we make sure the intake charge comes in and exhaust goes out the exhaust, and not exhaust going out the intake charge and diluting it and then getting pulled back in. So that's the deal as far as velocity is concerned. It is the key element to charging that cylinder at points where the intake charge normally wouldn't want to go in. Now, here's the important bit, and this is why velocity is important. Let's go back to the gun analogy again. The amount of energy that bullet has is dependent on its weight and the velocity squared. Now, let's say we increase the weight of the bullet by 10%. The energy in the bullet, if it travels at the same velocity as it did before, will go up by 10%. But now if we take the same bullet and increase the velocity by 10%, the energy will go up 22%. Think about that. That means that velocity is probably more important than outright flow. Again, let me quote Darren Morgan. The guy's really nailed it here. Velocity is the key element to a successful port. That's why flow figures on their own are not enough. Because you can have a port that's too big and sure it might flow better, but the velocity is dropped. If you pick up 10% flow, but you lose 10% velocity, you have lost out, because the reduced velocity will drop the energy by about 20%, whereas the increased flow at best will only increase it by 10%. So you'll be off. How do we go about getting what the port energy is? A figure for it. Now, the figure for it would be in foot-pounds. That is not to be confused with torque. Torque is pounds-feet. Kinetic energy is in foot-pounds. So, what we have here is a situation where we need to know what the speed, the mean speed of the port is, and the weight of air in it. From that, we can calculate how many foot-pounds of energy that port is capable of delivering. When that peaks out, that is the point at which we will get the most power increase. Well, how do we know when we have the exact maximum port energy? Well, I know it looks like I'm plugging it again, but the program that Stan and I wrote tells you just that. It will give you that number. You'll also be able to see how much you're off by looking at the port velocities and going for the ones that I'm now going to show in this chart. Using the numbers that I'm now showing in this chart, you can calculate the peak power that your engine is going to make for a given port speed. This will help you select a suitable cam for it, but let me home in on the figures you're going to need most. Let's look at conventional 2-valve stuff, because that's going to be what you need most. But here's the point. Let me just drop down a bit from that and look at the 3, 4, and 5-valve heads. You'll notice that the speed doesn't go up that much for a typical 4-valve, 3-valve or 4-valve head. It's only when we get to Formula One stuff that we start to see very high port speeds at maximum power. What this means is they've got the Mach number of the port way up there before it gets, how shall I say, inertially saturated. Now, ports like that can be done on flow benches, but let me tell you, it's a lot of work. It's even a lot of work when you've got CFD to help you out. Anyway, you've got your port speeds. You get the idea how important they are. Oh, and I'm going to throw in a graph. Just a simple graph. I want you to look at the blue figures on this graph and compare them with the red ones. The blue figures are 195cc port. It flowed slightly less right up at the top end of the lift than the 170 port that's shown in red, that was ported out to about 178. It flowed slightly more at the top end, but the port velocity was way up over the stock blue port. Look how much difference there is in torque, and that starts right down at the low RPM and continues right through the RPM range. Now, do I need to justify the acquisition of port velocity any more than that? I think not. Anyway, that brings me to the end of this video. Don't forget, we do need your support. Your subscription to our channel helps us on the YouTube algorithm to get more exposure, and that's exactly what we need. We are coming up on this channel for 60,000 subscribers, and on the other channel we're at close to 40,000. So all told, we are near 100,000 on MotorTech Features channels. But we still need more. To actually finance everything we need to do here, we actually need somewhere around 250,000 subscribers. I'm just worried if I'm going to last long enough to get there. But anyway, just please subscribe, and it wouldn't hurt for one of those super thanks with even $10. It's expensive to do what we do, but we give you the stuff you can't get anywhere else. Thank you for watching.